Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Big Thoughts, Little Talks, and part 2 of my conversation with a Donald Trump supporter. In part 1, we covered the philosophical groundwork behind her beliefs, and in this episode, we dive into the topic of abortion. We discuss why she is pro-life and how this issue has become the predominant one in guiding her political decisions. As always, if you choose to listen, I hope you also choose to listen with an open mind and a genuine desire to understand a perspective that might be different from your own. Without further ado, here is part 2 of my conversation with a Trump supporter. Voting for Trump, is it more of a, you're like enthusiastically supporting him, or you think he's the lesser of two evils? What's your attitude?
Yeah, good question. So I think in the last 4 years, I have become a fan of what he has done in one area in particular, and so I just learned that there is a term for this. I am a single issue voter, which
Okay.
I did not know existed, but that's what I am.
Okay.
And so with this single issue, I think that Trump has done a lot for my beliefs of this issue, and I think that that's something that not a lot of politicians can do.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. So.
All right. To learn more, you got to wait for another hour. No, this is
Thanks for sticking with me, Peter.
to find out what issue is the single issue. Please tune in next time.
But yeah, I'm cool to keep going if you are. I will actually
cool.
tell you what this issue is.
Yeah, this
in
is
the
good.
branches. Now that we're in the branches.
Yeah, I love how you're so prepared. Like, I feel like you're driving the conversation. I don't have to do any work. This is great.
Oh, God bless you, Peter. You're just letting me jabber and jabber. Okay, so at the branches level now, my one humanistic assumption that I make and base my further decisions politically off of is that here's this truth: life on Earth is good. And so that's our truth. Then again, we have that moral law that is derived from that. So if we have something that is good, it should be protected. So that's where the moral law comes in.
Okay.
And then going back again to our tree trunk, the civil law then should also reflect that moral law that life should be protected and civil law should protect life. So what is the actual application of this? Well, we've got, there are lots of different types of life, right? So there's plant life. So that's where we get environmentalism. The environment around us, it is good. It is something that we should protect. And so we should make laws that ensure the protection of the environment. We have animals around us. Animal life is good. So we have animal rights, and there are laws that I think, I'm pretty sure there are actual laws that protect animals from abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with humans. There's CPS. There are organizations that protect human life because it is good. There's healthcare. We've got all of these systems in place because life is good and it should be protected. How are you feeling with this so far?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think I can see where this is going, but yeah, I'll let you.
Yeah. So, and I think America is mostly on board with that too. Life is good, and again, we start with as an assumption in common,
Mm-hmm.
but the applications sort of differ. And I think one very poignant piece of evidence that America is definitely on board with, like, life is good and it should be protected is all of the outrage that came forth after George Floyd was killed. That this was a human life that was not protected when it should have been protected, and because of that, it was just this very wrong thing. And so there's a lot of outrage that came out of that. And I think that's something that, Americans can get behind.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so I guess the hairy part now that we've agreed, okay, yes, life is good.
Yep.
We've got lots of questions stemming from that. So, for example, how do we protect life? What protects life most effectively? Because, there's some things that protect life, but maybe there's something else that protects it a little bit better. Whose lives is the government responsible for protecting? Is it only just citizens, or is it immigrants as well, illegal immigrants?
Mm-hmm.
Is one life more valuable? Like, is there a law that deems more life one valuable than another just by the way that it's written? But then I think the most important question that sort of following the trend that we've been doing in our discussion so far is we have to define our terms. What is life? And I think because it is such an important issue, it should be defined. That there are so many things, so many laws, so many discussions and issues of morality that are based off of this, that we have to have a definition of it. It's not something that can stay, well, this is what I think life is. I think this is where the absolute objective truth comes in, that we have to decide when is the beginning of life and when is the end of life.
Yeah, I think though, we're talking about the topic of abortion, right? Like
Yeah.
this is essentially like when does
Surprise.
like, and I think that is the um yeah, like I think that is one of the most difficult points in that topic, which is like where does life begin? Where, and like that's such a complicated question, right? Because there's like suffering, like when some people say it's the heartbeat. So I should be fully transparent. I actually don't, like abortion is not a huge issue for me. Like that's not one of the most important things. I would say that I'm not, yeah, so I'm not really passionate going either direction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I'd like to, yeah, maybe I'll seed the question, then you can continue where you're going. But um, yeah, like how I'm wondering like how I would try to define life, and
Yeah.
like there's the biology, like with the biology background, like it's actually it's very difficult, right? It's like if you have a single cell, right? That's technically life. Like if it's replicating, if it has DNA, cellular machinery. But then there have been some researchers who were able to artificially create a cell. Like they like created this tiny little bag, like microscopic, and they added some DNA. They put some like these proteins in there, and then it started replicating itself. Like, is that life? Um, and so, like with the abortion issue, it's like when there's a single cell before and after fertilization. Like, is that a life? So, what is your, where do you draw that line?
Good question. So I think, in my opinion, um, that there is no definitive, like you said, it's very difficult. There is no definitive place to draw the line except for at conception. That if left alone, a fertilized egg will, by just the course of nature, turn into a baby. And there's nothing that, there's nothing that we have to do to ensure that it becomes a baby. If generally left alone, of course, you have, if you don't have prenatal care or something, then the baby just might die eventually of natural causes. But there is nothing that science has to interfere with that will make it turn into a baby. It's just what happens by nature. And so, what because I don't think there is any other place to draw that line, then there is no other place that you can draw that line. Some people sometimes also say, well, it's the age of viability. Well, with modern science, that age keeps getting push back. Like I was just reading today that there's been a baby who's born at 21 weeks who has survived. Like 21 weeks, regular pregnancy is 40 weeks.
Mhm.
And the third trimester only starts at 28 weeks. So, like, I think with something this important, and the idea that, with my idea that there is an objective, absolute moral truth, that it's not something that we can just change depending on, well, what can science do right now? That there is a time when a baby is a baby, and there's a time when an egg and a sperm are just an egg and a sperm, and once they meet, then in what I believe is that as soon as they meet, boom, that's a baby, that is a human being. They have the right to life.
So,
Yeah.
so I wonder, like, because obviously with like plants are a good example, right? Like plants are these multicellular organisms. They have no like, why are
Excuse
we
me.
okay just like eating plants? Like because they don't have any consciousness, right? They don't, like,
Mm-hmm.
they're not able to suffer. Um, Animals obviously is a tricky one because a lot of people are arguing that, like,
Yeah.
that's like we shouldn't eat animals because of that. Um,
Yeah.
so it seems to me like if we were just to, like, not like rely on concepts and just like try to look at the like scientific absolute truth, that if we compare like a plant, um, or even like a, yeah, like let's just say like algae or an amoeba or something, like a single cellular organism, and the egg right uh, right before or like right after the sperm enters the egg. Uh, Objectively, those two things are like before the sperm entered the egg and after the sperm entered the egg. Like there's this biological process where the egg reacts by forming this like kind of shield and becoming like, there's a biological thing that happens, but um, from an objective like point of view, nothing has changed, right? Like that egg is still just as consciousless and doesn't feel any suffering as when before the sperm entered it, right? Like, so like, would you like do you think
Uh,
something divine happens at that moment? Like, is there something physical,
well,
or is it
I
more
think
the concept?
the big change that has happened is that before the sperm entered the egg was just going to stay an egg. But after the sperm entered the egg that set in progress this development. Now this egg is going to split into two, whereas before it was just going to stay an egg and it was going to leave out just through the period. Um, and so I think that is actually a monumental change. Um, and I think that one other thing that I wonder if this is sort of one thing that tell me if I'm reading too much into this, but one thing that I am also making sure not to do is to define life, human life, as dependent on consciousness. And uh, you know, or intellectual ability, because I
Hmm.
think if you do that, then that sort of gets into you can fall down that slippery slope into saying, well, what if someone is severely mentally disabled, and is that less of a life than someone who isn't severely mentally disabled? And I would say, well, no, of course not. They should be protected, and I think that's one thing that I have seen that has I think become very unfortunate in our society today, is that children babies with disabilities found in utero are aborted more often than healthy. Well, I don't know if that's actually true. I don't have numbers to back that up, but they are more likely to be aborted. Is my guess.
Mhm.
And I think that's because the reason for that is that the valuation of life is not based off of the, I guess, presence of life. It is based off of the significance of that life.
What would you? So I guess like one response I might imagine to that is, it's not doubting the significance of life, but it is weighing the suffering potentially of like the lifespan of that life, right? Like if you know that this baby, you find out in utero that they are going to have a rare genetic disease that causes
Mm-hmm.
them to they're just going to be in a ton of pain,
Mm-hmm.
and they're like most of their life will be like suffering,
Mm-hmm.
um, not just for the baby but for the parents too, right? And it's just going to be
Mm-hmm.
this like, and this is sort of a thought experiment. There probably are rare diseases like this, but um, like like I feel like the picture is not, the morality picture isn't as clear cut there, right? Because like you could use the heuristic of like life is always better than no life, but if is a life that is constantly suffering uh, actually better than no life at all?
Mm-hmm.
And like, how would you respond to that scenario?
Yeah, good question. Well, I think I am going to use that heuristic and say that life is always, better than no life. Um, I think, that's a determination uh, that you or I, or I don't know, our legal system have no place in making for another human being.
So that's an interesting way to put it, because when you say that that's a like life or no life, is not a place for our legal system to make a decision on that. Is that what you?
No.
No,
So I guess the determination of suffering negates value of life.
I
I
see.
think I think that is I totally disagree with that, because you see people who do suffer a lot, who have chronic diseases, and they are still able to be happy. I don't think suffering completely, yeah, I don't think suffering negates the value of life, and I think that to assume that and then abort a baby based off of that is, presumptuous in a way. That like you have no capacity for happiness or enjoyment in this world because you will be in pain. And I think sometimes suffering isn't so bad actually. I mean, there is benefit in suffering. For example, like if you work out and you are super sore the next day and you're like, oh my gosh, why did I do this? But there's also that sense of satisfaction of like, yeah, my muscles are working. There is some satisfaction in that suffering. And like I think I have a very I think somewhat unique view of suffering, um because I do find value in it.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that, and like I think that at a certain point, like there's, uh, at a certain with enough perspective and uh, you know capability, you can really make the most of suffering as a functioning adult. But like just going back to that thought experiment of
Yeah.
if you had a baby that you knew they were going to be born, they were going to suffer just for a month as a baby and then die.
Hmm.
Um, that baby is not, doesn't have the capacity to be like, yeah, this is good. Like this is good suffering, and like I'm glad I did this, and then go away. Like that's just pain, and
Okay.
like in that case, like I don't know, it's still very fuzzy to me. Like, is that worth, um, like it's like the idea of like in movies like putting people out of their suffering, right? There's a reason for that, and which is like like sometimes it's actually like that suffering is still it's still meaningful. Like just like how you said that, you have this absolute truth of like life is good, and there's a right and wrong. Like I think like suffering is wrong, and like if we can minimize suffering, that's
Hmm.
that's for the best. And so, how would you um, respond to like a situation um, like that, where this just tragic scenario where that this baby is going to just suffer for like 1 month after birth and then die?
Hmm. Hmm. Um, I've watched an interview once with a couple actually who did like this happen to. They knew um, they knew the baby had some sort of disease that was life limiting, and I think the baby only lived for maybe a few days, and then the baby died, and that was it. But they still chose to have the baby, and I think as far as suffering goes, one one thing to keep in mind is that there are things like excuse me, palliative care, who's especially for cases like this, I'm sure um, the whole goal is to keep someone out of pain. Like if it's something that is avoidable, then we try to avoid it. And so, like as far as pain goes, uh, try to treat the pain. But I think that there is still good that came out of that baby, and hearing the parents talk about it, they got to they did experience parenthood. Um, I think the experience of parenthood starts actually with pregnancy. Because what is parenthood? It's when you what are the components of parenthood? I mean, this is very reductionistic, but you get to make sacrifices for your child. You get to um, experience joy in your child's triumphs. You get to express sorrow in your child's failures. Um, and you do experience all of that as even as a parent of a baby that's still in utero. You know, I c- moms make lots of sacrifices when the baby is still pregnant. They feel sick all the time and they can't
Hmm.
drink any alcohol. But you also, I mean, like as a pregnant mother, a pregnant mother gets to enjoy the joys of, oh my gosh, I think I just felt my baby kick, or wow, my baby is now the size of a blueberry. Before it was the size of a poppy seed. Like, that's awesome. Way to go, baby.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think, there is no way to predict the value that a life will have. But I think it is too presumptuous to assume that it will have no value, no impact of good right off the bat. Um, so actually, oh, sorry. Okay, I've finally thought of an example that.
Okay.
So have you have you heard the story of how California was started, or
uh,
California? Sorry, no, Stanford.
I don't think so.
Okay, so there was a boy. Uh, I think he was an only child, and he died when he was still a young man. And his parents were quite rich, and they were pretty devastated, and they wanted to do something in his honor, and so they started Stanford University. And there there must have been like so much suffering. I think that that suffering of losing a child is probably like one of the worst types of suffering there can be. But there was also, they found and produced so much good and so much value out of that. For example, my parents met at Stanford. So if that boy hadn't died, I wouldn't be here today. My parents would have never met. And, that's just like one one example of what I think is good.
Mhm.
Some good coming out of this big tragedy. And so I think suffering isn't without fruit.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. Like it is an interesting experiment though uh, to say like if you could go back in time and someone could save that boy, um, and like all the future, like you have a vision of what all these decisions are going to make. Like what if saving that boy uh, would have led to like not Stanford not being created and a lot of people not getting a good education and your parents not
Yeah.
meeting and you never being born. Yeah, what if the scales tip towards like, yeah, we actually this boy should die, and like that boy should be killed. Like I think that sort of it's I mean, now we're getting into like a bit of like um like fate and like cause and effect, but I
Mhm.
think that highlights like one of the reasons that this absolute like the absolute truth is just so hard to know sometimes, right? Like in like what if,
Exactly.
because if you have two absolute truths that conflict in that moment, like this, the life is good, if this boy didn't die, that would be better.
Hmm.
But if that boy died and then you were born and like more people were happier, um is it okay to kill a life for that, you know?
Yeah, good question. And so I think that's um well, I'm going to say it may not be the most elegant, but I think that's a good segue into sort of the next question that I have of like, you know, um, the question of how to order, um, what's the word? Goods, how to order rights.
Hmm.
So, I think generally from going back to abortion now, I think from the conversations that I've had with a bunch of other people too, uh, pro-choice arguments generally fall into one of two categories. Number one, this whole idea, this question of like when does life actually begin? That uh, some people who are in the pro-choice movement say, well, it doesn't begin at conception. And so we've already sort of talked a little bit about that. But then the second one is the choice of the mother and the possible burden of motherhood that outweighs the baby's right to life.
Hmm.
And so then it comes up this question of like, okay, now we have to order, because the right to autonomy is is a good that is a good thing. We uh, at least I believe that we have a will, and so it is a good thing to use that will and to employ that will. Though, to would that is it still good to use it to the detriment of a life? If you agree that yes, this baby is a full human being.
Hmm.
Um, and uh, I think I think one of the things that helps me sort of frame this is that, well, have you ever seen the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding?
No, I haven't.
What?
Yeah,
Oh,
I need
Peter.
to see that one.
Yeah, that one's a fun one. But there's this great scene. So the main character's dad is super super proud of his Greek heritage, and he's driving his daughter to school one day, and he's telling with one of her friends, and he's telling her friend, every word can be traced back to something in Greek. And the sassy friend is like, oh yeah, well then what about, and he says like, just give me any word and I'll explain to you why it's found its root in Greek. And the sassy girl is like, okay, what about kimono? and, And like the dad just sort of like spits some bullshit off about like, oh well, this part of the word is um so I sort of feel like that when I say what I'm about to say, which is all all laws in all civil laws are created ultimately, if you trace the purpose of it far back enough, it's ultimately to protect life.
Um, yeah, and maybe this is where that, like, we've had this distinction actually earlier on in the tree, lower down on the tree, but uh, I could argue that, like, I could also see an argument for that all laws were created to reduce suffering, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, which is, it seems maybe like a subtle change, but it is. I feel like there are implications with those
Yeah,
different changes.
yeah, I totally agree. I think that's a good eye in identifying that difference, because I think you know one difference that we've identified between the two of our opinions is that I think that suffering isn't necessarily bad, but it seems that in your tree the suffering is the definition of bad, I guess.
Yeah, and it's definitely. I mean, I agree that not all suffering is bad. Um, I think, like, and maybe just giving this example will help me word it better. But in the case of a person who is at the end of their life, who, and this is also a touchy subject, who wants to be put down, essentially, right? Like, they want to voluntary suicide, um, because they're just in a ton of pain. They, like, there are people that just would rather not continue living.
Right. Hmm.
And then there are kind of laws, like, around this idea of protecting life that don't let people do that. And
Yeah.
I think that that's, yeah, I don't know how to justify that. It's like, this person who's an adult, right, who's making their own decisions, they're suffering, and you're not letting them, like, make a choice, which is a very personal decision, um, to receive help in ending their life. Um, so yeah, I'm curious, like, what, how do you vision, like, what I can kind of imagine what your stance would be on that, which I guess would be that it's there should be laws to protect people from doing that.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I am against physician assisted suicide, euthanasia. um I I think that unfortunately oftentimes um you know the approach that hospice and palliative care is severely underutilized in the United States. Um, and, and but however, in these cases, probably they've the person has been on palliative care or hospice care for a while. Um, but you know, I think there's still this ultimate good, this ultimate truth of life. Life is a good thing and it should be protected. And uh, you know, also the idea that you know suffering isn't bad. So both of those ideas are very, I guess, fundamental in why I don't condone physician assisted suicide or euthanasia. Um,
But there's the other argument, which also applies to both abortion and physician assisted suicide, which is, you can have, um, like, which is, I guess, it's centered around the truth of autonomy. So we've talked about protecting
yeah,
life, we've talked about suffering, um, which we might have some different views on. But then there's also the idea of autonomy. Like, is that a fundamental truth? Like, should people be able to have the autonomy to choose, even if, um, the people, like, some people disagree with that, um, and if the laws, like, or should there be laws that prevent people from being able to live their life in a way that doesn't harm anyone else but themselves?
right. Yeah, good question. Okay, so I think that makes it very clear what you're. So I would say that we have to sort of prioritize certain certain truths, certain rights over others. And to do this, looking at the formation of our country, I look at the Declaration of Independence. We just had 4th of July not too long ago. And my family and I, we actually read the Declaration of Independence, which I hadn't done in a while.
I don't think I've ever read it. That's
It's
cool.
yeah, it was. I definitely would recommend it. I think it's actually I screenshotted a picture of it that I wanted to. I'll pull up on my phone. Hashtag nerd. But so in the Declaration of Independence, let me pull up this screenshot. Thomas Jefferson writes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men." And then that's as far as my screenshot goes. But that the part that I want to zoom in on is, he says life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. I don't think that ordering was accidental. And I guess there's no way to really confirm this. I wish we could, talk to Thomas Jefferson and get the down and low from him. But I think that without the right to life, all other rights are moot. If you can't be assured of your right to life, then what assurances do you have of any other right? Like the right to bear arms, for example. What's the point of arguing? And so this, I guess, is ultimately why I'm a one what is it called? A one issue voter.
Single issue voter.
Yes, thank you. Single issue voter is that I feel the need to prioritize my my goals for, the vision that I would like the United States to sort of become. And excuse me. And if we can't assure the protection of life, then what can we assure?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's yeah, I'm kind of getting a clear picture of your perspective and how it differs. It's like it really comes down to the fundamental like orderings of like of three like major things, which are like protection of life, protection of liberty, and also like pursuit of happy, or like not, we haven't been phrasing it as pursuit of happiness, but like suffering, like the reducing suffering, or like enabling happiness.
Right.
Yeah, I think that it's just hard for me to imagine in the case of like there's like if you just imagine there are people that commit suicide all the time, and if it's like if that's something that's illegal, right? Like what does that really mean? Because ultimately the person has liberty and they have autonomy, right? It's like, what if possible, would it be moral, would it be ethical to, like, if people had a chip implanted or something that like when they're trying to commit suicide, or if they had thoughts of suicide, then they like intervene, right? Because then like maybe if you had this argument that life is above everything, like protecting life is the most important, then you might say, yeah, that makes sense. I would say that would be highly immoral and unethical, because it's like you like if a person has, if you're infringing on this person's liberty, I feel like that is that overrides it, especially if it's not, we're not talking about, I think it's simpler to talk about a single person's life rather than with abortion. There's just two lives, but like if there's a single person's life and they wanted to take their life, obviously they're like, it's not a good situation. Ideally, we would be able to provide them support and help, but like if there was an intervention of some sort, which is sort of what Like I think like some of the um, the assisted suicide is, paraplegics. They can't actually physically like do it. Otherwise, they probably would do something themselves. In a way, you're like not like, if there was someone physically able and they would live in this world, like would your ideal world, like what would that look like? How would you prevent people from doing it? And like, do you view the people that have committed suicide like in a different way? Like what is your, like, how do we um, treat that sort of situation?
Yeah. Um, very interesting thought, or like hypothetical situation of this chip. I, you know, I would probably opt like don't put in the chip, because then that sort of um, opens up the possibility of abuse of that chip for whoever is like programming this or monitoring this chip. And I think that's perhaps even opens up even more dangers. Um, but I think, you know, well, so looking at another, I guess, application in this, one thing that one interesting discrepancy that I've sort of noticed in our healthcare system is that if someone it goes to the hospital and is suicidal, and they're admitted because they're suicidal, they're put on what's called suicide precautions. And what that means is that, you know, there is nothing in the room that they could possibly use to harm themselves with, and they always have someone who is there watching them to make sure they don't try to do anything.
Hmm.
And so uh, it's just, you know, protocol through, I think, the majority, if not all, hospitals in the United States.
Yeah.
And so then you have that, but then you also have in some states physician assisted suicide, which, you know, I think, uh, you know, our healthcare system hasn't really decided yet, because for the fact that we still have both of these systems. There's some places where you allow this, and there's some places where it's like, if anyone comes in is suicidal, then we put them on suicide precautions. Um,
Yeah, and I think that this is like it's actually pretty analogous, I think, that to like, if we're going to compare like with the abortion, and this is kind of where my beliefs sort of lie, is
yeah,
it's very, it's not very black and white. Like it's very and I think that I'm probably less uh yeah, I'm definitely more centrist, like center than like some people are on abortion, right? Where it's like, just any term, like whatever time, it's all the mother's choice. Like I'm definitely not I don't have that view. Like I think that um but I like I'll just give an example with this assisted suicide of, maybe the world that we live in is, it's like, I also don't think it's like, all right, we should have assisted suicide centers where people are like, hey, like, do you want to assist suicide? Like maybe if we had a process in place where you have to go to hospice, or you find a hospice, end of life palliative care, and then like after, like if that doesn't work out, and obviously process it always leads to complications, but ideally, like if that doesn't work out, they try that, um, and at a doctor's recommendation, or like the palliative care recommendation, they're like, yeah, we've tried this, they're still in a lot of pain, they still want to do this, um, then like there's a process to do that. Similarly with abortion, like I think if there are certain cases, right, where um, like if the mother's life is in danger, that's the one that's talked about a lot, or if there's like certain choices with like the disease where like there are hard decisions to make, I think that that should be sort of like there should be sort of rules in place, or sort of like process that can help.
right.
Unfortunately, I don't think that's very realistic, because with anytime you set a process, then there's always ways to exploit loopholes and things like that.
One one book that I actually would definitely recommend to you in regards to this end of life discussion of especially like when we were talking about the paraplegic who, you know, feels like I want to end my life. I would highly recommend the book. I think it's called The Bell and the Butterfly. Have you heard about it?
Nope, I haven't.
It's written by a man who, I think he used to be a journalist. He has locked-in syndrome, which basically means that he can't move any part of his body, but his mind is still completely intact. But he can move one eyelid, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I think he has voluntary movement out of one eyelid or something like that. And so he wrote this entire book by communicating with his family with his one eyelid, and composing this book. And it's a beautiful testimony to the value that life can still have when you're paraplegic, or when you don't, when your body doesn't function as like it normally should. And so, I mean, that's sort of like an off, I guess some food for thought. If you ever are interested in reading it, I highly recommend it. It's beautiful. Like, also just the amazing feat of being able to compose a whole book in your head and have to do it one letter at a time. So
Yeah.
how he did it is his family would like have a little card, and they'd point to the letters, and he'd blink when they got to the letter that he wanted.
Holy shit, that's insane.
Right? Yeah. It's absolutely incredible. And he composed this whole book this way. And I mean, granted, it's a short book, but I mean,
I just
so
imagine like it's like a single page. I'm sorry, that's horrible. I'll definitely check
so
it out.
that's one resource. And then going back to something that you mentioned too, with the abortion side of it, of the if the life of the mother is endangered. And actually, I think this is an interesting concept, because there is a principle in healthcare, an ethical principle. It's the idea that if you do something with the intention of, so for example, in this case of the mother's life is in danger, say the mom has cancer and she needs to get chemotherapy, but the chemotherapy that she would get would endanger the life of the baby.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue that, and according to this principle, it is still ethical to give the mother the chemotherapy, because your primary objective is saving the life of the mother, is protecting the life of the mother. Now, the unfortunate consequence of this, of course, would be that the baby might die. Not necessarily a certainty, but definitely a more a high possibility of that.
Okay.
And so the reason that I say that that's okay is because the thing that you're trying to achieve is to protect life, is to save life.
But I feel like that's just a framing that you can change. Like that's just a concept that we like that we just create in our minds of like, all right, our objective, because like that's like an objective can be, you can change an objective just by thinking some different thoughts, right? Like you can imagine like chemotherapy, like our objective is to protect the baby because we think the baby's life is more important. So like who defines that objective, and like why like what makes that morally better in that case?
So I think in that case, in that particular case, granted, so we were talking about how with this objective truth, it's still very complicated. It doesn't mean that because there's only one of it, it doesn't mean that it's cookie cutter simple. So I think in this particular case, the mother is the one, or I mean, I guess the mother with the father, ideally, but the mother,
Mm-hmm.
because it is her life and her child's life, she's the one who decides to opt in for chemotherapy or to opt out of chemotherapy. And I
So
think it has happened before, both with both results. Both results have happened before, and I think both are, I don't condone or condemn one or the other,
Okay,
because the objective is still
sorry, just so
protection.
to clarify, so you're saying that in the case of a mother who has cancer and who has the decision whether or not to get chemotherapy to save her life, but it might kill the baby, you think that because it's the mother's choice there, that it is okay, it is morally right to for the mother to put her life or like to get the chemo treatment. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
And so I think one also good distinction is to say that she is not opting to uh, have have an abortion. She's opting to get therapy that might cause an abortion. The law
Okay.
of double effect. That's what it's called. The law of double effect. Oh my gosh, thank you. Oh, my brain. um,
Yeah, I think my brain is also slowing down, so maybe we can wrap up and maybe do a part two where we actually talk about Donald Trump. But
uh,
um, and let me just. I had one more question. So I guess like the truth, like what is right or wrong in this case, in your perspective, is kind of influenced by the intent. Because like if the mother had chemo or had cancer and it's the same mother, and then she was like, I want to get chemo to save my cancer. What if the mother was like, I want to get chemo as a way to get an abortion? Would those be different situations in your mind?
I think in the legal system, no. In the individual moral system, on the basis of on the level of a person's conscience, absolutely, yeah.
But
I think the law of the double effect is entirely dependent on intention. You know, it is the intention to cure the cancer. It is not the intention to abort the baby. For another example, in hospice, uh, giving morphine, it is the intention to relieve pain. It is not the intention to uh, depress the respiratory system.
right. So in the case of an abortion where um, the doctors has determined that getting an abortion or having the child would risk the mother's life, so we're getting an abortion to save the mother's life. Does that would that is that something that you're okay with then as well? Like if it's like the having the child is likely going to harm the mother, kill the mother. Um,
Gotcha. Good question. Does that exist? I don't know. Very good question. I don't know if I have an answer for you for that. So the life saving therapy then would be the abortion. Like it isn't something that might cause a spontaneous abortion. Is that what you're
right,
saying?
right.
Very good question. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have an answer for you
All
for
right, maybe
that.
we can stop there and sleep on that question. And
Yeah.
yeah, because I think that when you gave the chemo example, that's kind of like the idea that came in my head, which is because before we're like our abortions are wrong because like the initial argument was that you value life above everything else, and then in a situation like this, it's like there are two lives,
Right.
and in one case now we're not talking about like now we're talking about intentions now, like intentions are coming into play, and I feel like that's where things get especially fuzzy.
Mhm.
But thanks for talking. Do you think this is a good okay point to
Yeah,
end
yeah,
with?
absolutely. I mean, I think I don't know if you'll get much useful stuff out of me anymore.
Like
Yeah, well,
why?
I think it's probably important to say this as a single issue voter that um, I think I was talking to my cousin once about this, and she's saying, well, how can you ignore all the other issues? Don't the other issues matter to you? And I agree. Being a single issue voter is very reductionistic. Absolutely, 100%. There's no denying that. And do the other issues that come up in political debates matter? Absolutely. Yes, 100%. I think perhaps next time we can sort of talk about, you know, a little bit more about why I think that it's okay to, with this particular issue, why it's okay to push everything else to the wayside, in favor of, like, I want to make sure that this issue is advocated for in the way that I want it to be advocated for. Because I think, that's a very legitimate that's a very legitimate objection to being
Yeah.
a single issue voter, because there are so many things that matter in the progress of society. But I don't want to get into it right now because then we'll be
Cool.
here for another 2 hours.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
um, mhm.
Cool. So yeah, maybe we can do like another follow up that's focused on, like, now that we have the foundation, we can talk about like more of like a back and forth on like how we balance all the issues and who's the better
Yeah,
choice for president and stuff like that. But
yeah, absolutely.
cool.
Well,
All
thank you
right.
so much, Peter.
Yeah. Thank you. This is a marathon. I appreciate you staying up late
Oh
over
yeah.
there.
No, you did great too. You're a very, very good listener.